Hello. In this part, I would like to talk about Freud's book, Sigmund Freud's book, titled The History of the Psychoanalytic Movement. Let's begin by talking about the aim of the book. What does Freud want to do in this book? He wants to, it's fair to say that he wants to tell the story of how psychoanalysis developed, first in Vienna, then in other places, including Switzerland and the United States. Parts of the book are autobiographical. He talks about how he was initially rejected by everybody, didn't receive any positive feedback from the medical community or the academic psychological community, how everybody was quiet after his talks and his presentations at the conferences, and he saw a space growing around him. So part of it is personal. But in addition to those autobiographical statements, Freud also wants to distinguish his vision of psychoanalysis from those of Jung, Carl Jung, and Adler, Alfred Adler, who were gaining popularity at the time of writing this book, this little history, the history of psychoanalysis. Let me begin with two points that I found quite amusing in this book. One of them from the beginning of the book, and the other one towards the end of the book. Towards the end of the book, Freud talks about Jung's version of psychoanalysis and makes fun of it. And he says that Jung sees the psychological drives to be mythical and semi-religious in nature. And Jung keeps saying that something deep is going on, that is noble in our unconscious. Wants to paint a noble image, an image of our unconscious that has nobility, and it's favorable. It's a pleasant image. And Freud says, Freud brings in a funny story as an analogy to kind of make fun of Jung. He says that there was a man, he talks about a story of a man who insisted that his family roots, his parents, were aristocrats. They were noblemen. And when other people discovered that that's not the case, when other people in his town discover that his parents are ordinary people, he then decides to forge some documents about his parents' parents. And so the forged documents state that his parents' parents were aristocrats and noblemen. So Freud says that Jung is doing something similar. Jung, after being confronted with the sexual character, but maybe unpleasant character of deeper psychological forces, he wants to go a step deeper and say, fine, okay, there are unconscious forces that have a sexual nature, but there's something even deeper beyond them, and that deeper level is noble. And Freud follows up and responds to these statements and says that if Jung pays attention, if we and Jung pay attention to the psychoanalysis of children, we will find out that Jungian theories cannot withstand clinical observation. And then he writes this really funny statement that he says, in fact, Jung himself, before he became enlightened, quote unquote enlightened, Jung himself made such clinical observations himself before abandoning the old-fashioned Freudian psychoanalysis. The second amusing remark that I promised to share with you is at the beginning of the book. And this is regarding the origin of psychoanalysis. And Freud here says that we can divide people into two camps. There are people who like psychoanalysis and there are people who don't like it. People who don't like it say that psychoanalysis began with Freud. But people who like it, they give credit to Joseph Breuer, who Freud began his career working with. Yeah, sorry about my cat making noises. Freud traces his interest in childhood, where and why he started to pay attention to his patients' childhood events by talking about the early case studies with Breuer. He writes that a pathological experience, so an adult person who has experiences that are unpleasant, they're pathological, like neurotic experiences. These pathological experiences always seem to presuppose an earlier pathological experience, which, maybe an earlier experience, which maybe itself is not pathological, but due to some other reason, maybe it was traumatic or some other reason, gave a pathological quality to later experiences. That's why it is useful for psychoanalysis to keep going back until reaching childhood. So these early experiences, they shape, they give qualities, they give a pathological character to possibly to later experiences, and made it probable that a person, they make it probable that a person later would regress back to those earlier experiences. So when an adult faces a trauma or a difficulty, a difficult relationship, they start to go back to those earlier experiences in which they had early on a trauma in a relationship with their maybe parents. Freud also talks about his discovery of transference, and he says that I take transference as an evidence that neurosis is attached to sensual or sexual relationships. He writes about how regression is the main pillar of psychoanalysis. So this is, I think, a very important statement that we read in this book, that his beliefs, at least in 1914, he takes repression, which is setting aside some memories or some of the experiences, pushing them into the unconscious. So repression is the main pillar of psychoanalysis, which is why, by the way, this is the reason why Michael Billig's book on Freud, titled Freudian Repressions, is such an important book, and it represents, I think, progress in and beyond Freudian tradition. Okay, let's go back to Freud himself. Freud attributes the popularity of psychoanalysis, the fact that it happened to become more popular with time. He says part of that was due to the group of people interested in his work who were in Zurich, Switzerland. And the two main characters associated with the Zurich branch of psychoanalysis were Carl Jung and Bleuler. I forgot Bleuler's first name. So his cooperation with them started around 1907, and then 2 years later, in 1909, there was that famous visit to the US, Clark University. Freudian psychoanalysis, we read in this book, Freud clearly states a couple of times that Freudian psychoanalysis is not a system, and I was actually wrong about this. This was not the impression I got when I read other works by Freud. He states this because he wants to distinguish his version of psychoanalysis with Alfred Adler's work. Because Alfred Adler aims to construct a system. Adler overestimates, according to Freud, he overestimates the role of the conscious mind. And because of that, Adler's system is vulnerable to the very things that psychoanalysis identifies as problems, including rationalization. So Alfred Adler, unlike Freud, has too much faith, too much emphasis in the conscious mind, and underestimates the unconscious. But let me also add this: despite heavy criticisms of Adler's psychology, Adler later called it individual psychology. Despite all those criticisms, Freud still prefers Adler to Jung. Because Jung changed psychoanalysis too much, and he created his own version that is, according to Freud, difficult to even understand. So unlike Adler, Adler at least constructed a consistent and intelligible, meaningful, maybe flawed, but meaningful system of psychology. But the character of Jung's theories, according to Freud, is so confusing, difficult to even understand what it is. Something else that Jung does is that he completely abandons repression, which was, to Freud, as we said already, it was a major pillar of psychoanalysis. In a letter exchange, Jung tells Freud about how their ideas. So Jung writes to Freud and says, "Oh, it's exciting. Our ideas are spreading and becoming more and more popular." And Freud is not happy with that because, as he writes back to Jung, Freud says, "There's nothing to be proud of in gaining popularity, in a public acceptance of our ideas, if it comes out of sacrificing the essential features of our ideas. So Freud sees in Jung, he says Jung is becoming more popular, but he's paying a heavy price. He's changing psychoanalysis too much. Let me say one last thing that Freud points out in this book, and that is this, I think, very important point, that analysts themselves are also human, and it is safe to assume that most of them will not live up to the demands of proper psychoanalysis. What is it that is demanded from psychoanalysts? It is a kind of honesty and ethics that is required in analysis, in continuing to overcome the resistances and rationalizations that psychoanalysis identifies in our motives, in resisting, being honest and resisting the self-serving bias. All right, so this is my summary of Freud's book, The History of the Psychoanalytic Movement. Thank you for listening.